A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars, they've been wrong about jobs, they've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. I'm Matt Wingard, and with me as always is my friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
Want to welcome the Gab community and all of you from the Gab community who are listening. You can hear previous episodes of this and, of course, the current episode on iTunes and SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast. We play on the weekends on the405media.com at 5 p.m. on Saturday and Sunday. If you want to write to ask me a question, my email is mattmwingard@gmail.com. So it's mattmwingard@gmail.com. So Judge Roy Moore beat Luther Strange in the Alabama race. That was absolutely no shock or surprise. He beat him by 10 points, essentially. And we talked in a previous podcast about why the president was backing Strange. He needs to honor commitments and loyalty to folks who've delivered the votes that he's asked them to deliver there in D.C. That doesn't necessarily mean that he minds that Judge Moore won or that he's hurt by that. The movement is not entirely him. The movement includes him, but the movement is bigger than him. There is Trump, and then there is Trumpism, and we're going to talk more about that in this show. I encouraged people to support Roy Moore because of the message that it sent. There may, in the end, not be a terrible difference between how the two of them would have voted, but the establishment certainly thought that Luther Strange was more loyal to them, and they spent $30 million, wasted $30 million on that race. And I knew that they were watching that race as an indicator, and that was why it was important to send a strong message. And it worked just like we hoped it would, because obviously they knew that Strange was going to lose and lose big, because an hour or so before the results were even announced, Bob Corker in Tennessee announced that he would not be running for re-election. So that was a huge, huge victory for us in sending the message. They're clearly worried. So we now have an opponent against Jeff Flake in Arizona, although, again, I would not be surprised if you see a congressperson step forward to run against Flake. So there may be a stronger candidate than Kelly Ward. I have some concerns that that may be designed to divide the opposition against Flake so that he can survive a primary fight, but we'll have to see who announces and how that all shakes out. Tarkanian is running against Dean Heller in Nevada, and now we have an open seat in Tennessee. Some names that are being kicked around. Marsha Blackburn would be a great candidate for that. Apparently even Peyton Manning is considering throwing in for that. So we'll see who ends up getting in that race, and we obviously want the best Trumpist candidate that we can find. If you want proof that they're scared, literally 24 hours after that election result, the House announced that it would be moving a $10 billion border wall bill. Now, that probably can't pass in the Senate, so it's all for show, but it's a sign that they're frightened because they clearly understand that they're headed into the primary races with very little to show. They think that the tax bill is somehow going to be some great accomplishment and will satisfy. The only people it's going to satisfy is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And I've talked about this before, and I'll say it again. The tax bill is important to Trump's overall economic plan, and it's clearly a priority for him because he believes getting the rates down will help him to achieve that 3 to 4% annual growth that he's looking for. So it is important, but as I've warned repeatedly, from a political standpoint, that's like just serving vegetables to the kids. You cannot have just that be this lone accomplishment. There needed to be a whole bunch of nationalist items that passed at the same time so that it was a full dinner and you didn't allow the press to simply focus on the tax cuts. You needed the Obamacare repeal and replace. You needed an infrastructure bill. You needed budget cuts because all of that allows conservatives to talk and rally around all of the accomplishments, and it spreads the opposition out. Now they can concentrate their fire on probably the weakest item in the political agenda, because it is tax cuts for the wealthy. I mean, it just is, because half the people in this country aren't paying federal taxes. So if you're going to go after those tax rates, you have to, and lower them, you're lowering them for the only people left that are paying them, and that's the wealthiest people in the country. And you lower that corporate rate, which again is important. It's vital for competitiveness in world markets. That's why Trump wanted it down to 15%. It may only end up at 20%, but that is a tax cut for corporations. And while it's, again, part of an overall economic plan, it's important. As a standalone piece, naked by itself, it looks pretty crass. If that's the only thing you can accomplish, then the GOP can only apparently accomplish something for its wealthy donors, and it cannot accomplish anything for any of its other constituent elements. It's pathetic. So if they move DACA now, they're going to be annihilated next year. I mean, I think the one upside to their inability to get the healthcare thing through at all, including the Graham-Cassidy bill, which I never believed was going to be successful. I learned my lesson, Doris. I thought they could pass the first one. Once they didn't, I was convinced that they wouldn't do the second one either. But if they're unable to accomplish any of their other goals, and then they try to move a bill to hand out citizenship or legal status to hundreds of thousands of illegals who are here, that's the end of them. I mean, I agree that they mostly don't understand the trouble they're in. They do have some inkling, and I think there's just enough of a flicker of survival instinct there to not move it, but we'll be watching it closely.
But if they get the elements that go with DACA that we want, E-Verify and merit-based immigration, and what was the other third point?
Well, an end to birthright citizenship, but they're not going to include that. They're not going to include that. And I'm not even sure that a bill with those other things can move successfully. Yes, if they got some kind of comprehensive bill that dramatically changed and altered the immigration system in the country, that's a much, much better bill. And it does, everything's going to be kind of around how they craft that legal status for DACA. How many does it include? Does it allow them in turn to bring chain migration? Those questions have to be answered going forward. But I would still argue that if that's the only thing they can accomplish is some compromise bill to help out people who are here illegally, it still looks terrible, and no one's going to be satisfied with any compromise bill. So I think they can't move anything like that. We'll just watch it as it happens. Here's a reason that they don't understand, do not comprehend, and are blind to this. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce's endorsement in primary races next year will be the kiss of death. Where there are primary challenges, and I'm hoping there are going to be a bunch of them, the U.S. Chamber is going to side with the establishment candidate. And that's going to be great, because they're going to paint the dots for us on every candidate that we know that we need to defeat in the primary. And it's going to be very easy to figure out who to vote for in the primary. When you look at your voter's pamphlet statement or whatever information is sent to you in the mail, look for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's endorsement and vote for the other person.
Wow.
So I read this column that I'm recommending you all go and search for. It's by Kurt Schlichter, and I'm going to read some segments from it, but I really encourage you to read the whole thing. First of all, it's delightful. I hope you all took my recommendation and watched the CBS interviews with Bannon, Charlie Rose interviews with Bannon, because they were wonderful. I'm giving you good programming here, folks. We talk a lot about stuff in Hollywood that isn't worth watching, but I'm counter-programming, and I'm recommending the good stuff to you. Seek out this column. You will enjoy it. But I'm going to read a few paragraphs from it to give you a sense of it, because I think that his column is essentially an encapsulation of everything that this podcast has talked about for months now. Everything that this podcast is about. So, from Kurt Schlichter's column, he says, quote, "Gosh, I would have thought that all those cruise panels about how our crumbling culture is slouching towards Babylon and the need to resist the liberal onslaught, that maybe we ought to actually resist the liberal onslaught. But, see, that was my mistake. I took it seriously when Conservative Inc. promised to fight the leftist blitzkrieg against normal Americans. It was all a scam, a lie, a pose for rubes. The true cons didn't actually mean it. Conservatism has become a racket, and everything happening now is a result of its members hoping to wait out Trump and the demand for change he represents. Maybe if they do nothing but say all the right things, we normals will get tired and go back to our jobs and keep providing those votes and renting those cruise cabins. But that's not happening. We aren't going away. Business as usual is over. We aren't just giving up, tossing away our country, and submitting to the ruling caste. We were nice with the Tea Party. Trump's not nice. What's coming after is going to be much, much less nice. Who are the normals? The Americans who built this country and defended it. When you eat, it's because a normal grew the food, and another normal trucked it to you. When you aren't murdered in the street, or don't speak German, it's because a normal with a gun made those things not happen. We normals don't want to rule over others. We don't obsess about how you live your life, but we also don't want to be compelled to signal or approve or pick up the tab. We are every color and creed, though when someone who is incidentally a member of some other group aligns with normals, he, she, z, loses that identity. The left drums normals who are black out of its definition of black, just as normal women get drummed out of womanhood, and normal gays get drummed out of gayhood. In a way, the left is making e pluribus unum a reality again. To choose to be normal is to choose to reject silly identity group identification and unite. Instead of saying normal Americans, you just say Americans. Militant normalcy is growing as normals awaken to the indispensable truth of our enemy's implacable hatred for us and everything we hold dear, like America. The sight of moron sports ball players disrespecting normals warms libs' frigid little hearts. And make no mistake, that diss is aimed straight at us, not at some musical number. But we're not giving up, and we're not going to sit back and just take it. Militant normalcy is the result of normal people roused to anger and refusing to be pushed around anymore. We prefer a free society based on personal liberty and mutual respect, but if you leftists veto that option, that leaves us either a society where you rule and oppress us, or one where we hold the power. So let me break this down, both for the left and for their fussy Friedacon enablers. You don't get to win. End quote. That's great stuff, and I highly recommend you go find the column. Conservative Inc. is being replaced by Us Militant Normals. You can find it on townhall.com, and it's by Kurt Schlichter, which leads me to my next subject. So I follow people I don't always agree with, including some other elements of the GOP on social media, and there was one guy who tweets a lot about terrorism that I like, and he went on a rant about the Tea Party candidates in 2010. Some of whom imploded and cost us some seats. And his argument was that we should always think about the general election. So I got some things to say about this. One is that this gentleman, while he's very good on terrorism issues, was not a Trump supporter in the primary. He got on board in the general election, but was definitely not a Trump supporter in the primary. And there are three types of Republicans now when it comes to not issues, because the issues appear in all three types, but there are three types as it relates to Trump and Trumpism. There's the never-Trumpers, who've never gotten on board. And then there's what I call the post-primary Trump supporters. And these are people who don't really like Trump. They still have problems with the style, but they're loyal to the party and they agree with some elements, usually not the nationalist elements of Trumpism, but the conservative elements. And so they back the play, if you will. And then the third group are the Trumpists, like us, the people who were there early and who understand what he's doing and love what he's doing and love having a fighter who actually fights the fight against the other fighters. So the other thing I'd say is we're not playing this general election game anymore. We've heard this before. And I would argue that the Tea Party movement in 2010 improved the GOP caucus. We don't have a majority of the House or the Senate when it comes to an actual conservative caucus, but there are far fewer rhinos now than ever, frankly. And there's certainly more conservatives than before FDR was elected. So what the Tea Party did worked. Trump has showed us how many traitors and saboteurs we have in the mix. I say it's better to lose a seat than to have a McCain who deflates the base. The thing about these rhinos in power is that they demoralize the voters and, the regular folks who are donating their time and energy to these campaigns. And it energizes the liberal commanding heights. People like McCain give succor to the left all the time. So it's a double negative. It not only hurts our own side, but it energizes the other side, and they have to go. And this call that we hear, we have to worry about the general election, it's selective. It's a selective memory of what happened in 2010. Because, yeah, there were some people who turned out to be lousy candidates, but there were lots of others who turned out to be great candidates. And they're great additions to Congress, and they won. We got this argument last year in backing McCain over Kelly Ward, and he barely squeaked by in that primary. And then he went on to win, promising the whole time to back the wall. And look at what this SOB has done now. It was a mistake not to nominate Kelly Ward, period. So, if you follow that advice, you get more McCains, and it's redonkulous. It's redonkulous. I say the Tea Party deserves a lot of praise for the insurgency that they mounted in 2010, most of which was done early on just by rank-and-file folks. It truly was a grassroots uprising, and that uprising was due to the Republican duplicity and outright lying, and it led ultimately to Trump. And there's going to be something worse for GOP-E and for liberals that comes after Trump if we don't actually accomplish some things. They're not who they claim to be, and they deserve to be challenged. This argument for the general election is just a call to retreat again and let the establishment folks tell us who and who isn't viable. Remember that they said that Trump could not win the general election. This was the main argument used against Trump because they didn't want to say that they actually disagreed with him on immigration and some of these other issues. But remember back to the primary when they said, this guy's so uncouth and he's so unpresidential, there's no way he can win the general election. If Republicans nominate Donald Trump as their standard bearer, the party will implode. He will set us back decades. That was the argument from these folks, and it was dead wrong. Dead wrong. Not only did he win the nomination, he won the general election, and he won states that Republicans had given up on. So this is a crap argument. I say we flood the zone with our Trump candidates next year. And they're not all going to be gems. Some of them are going to turn out to be idiots. But we will still have made progress. We will still have improved the caucuses. We'll have far fewer traitors than we had before, and fewer to deal with. But we're not going to get there by falling back into old patterns of nominating the person we think can win the general election. We're done with that. We nominate the best Trump nationalist candidate that we can find, and if they're not perfect, it doesn't matter. As I've said before in this podcast, the Senate is not going to the Democrats. It's just a matter of who's up for re-election in this next cycle. It is virtually impossible for the Democrats to take back the Senate. They are going to be defending 10 seats in Trump states. 10 seats. So it's a free shot on goal for us to target incumbents. And like I said, we've made real progress in the Arizona, Nevada, and Tennessee races. I think those are really the three primaries where we can make our statement to the GOP. But we also need to keep our eye on the candidates running in these 10 seats because, yes, we want to knock the Democrat off in the general election, the incumbent, but we want to make sure that we have a Trump nationalist. And we should not be afraid to hold these candidates accountable in the primary. And if we have any inclination, based on their past history, that they will not be a Trump nationalist, I think we should consider running a Trump nationalist candidate against them in the primary. And you're going to hear a lot of squawking from the GOP that, oh my gosh, this is a chance to take back this seat. Don't wreck this. Don't wreck this. What, so they can give us another McCain in there? I mean, I'd rather have the Democrat in the seat than to replace them with a John McCain. It's worse to have a John McCain, far worse. I would also remind you that we've heard this about on the presidency. We heard for 30, 40 years, you can't nominate this really conservative person because they won't win the general. And that got a lot of conservative candidates knocked out in the primary. But the last time that we nominated a conservative candidate and actually lost the general was Barry Goldwater, basically the first time we did it. And ever since then, when we've managed to slip a conservative candidate, a fighter, onto the ballot, he's won. Ronald Reagan and then Donald Trump. We could argue about whether W was conservative, but the point is that whenever we've nominated the not-so-conservative candidate, the one who everybody says can win the general election, those candidates have gone down in flames time and time again. So this theory does not hold a lot of water, and you need to hold it up against the facts and reject it. So apparently, in the effort to try to take down Trump or to oppose Trump and their voters, the NFL recently said, hold my beer. I want to give you a little background to explain why I think Trump was genuinely motivated to oppose those protests against the national anthem and the American flag. But I think he also saw an opportunity with the NFL. I'm going to take you back to the 80s when there was a competitor league to the NFL called the USFL, and Trump owned a team. And the NFL used its monopoly position to prevent the USFL from getting the kind of exposure on television and other places that they needed to survive. The USFL owners sued the NFL, and they won the case, but the jury awarded them $1. Generally, that's a jury saying, you're right on the law, but either we don't like you or we love the other side so much that we're not going to give you any money. Don't think that Trump didn't hold a grudge as a result of that, because they were right and the jury agreed that they were right, and they all lost money because of what the NFL did. So do I think he was holding a grudge against the NFL? Yeah, I think he has been. And I think the NFL gave him a beautiful opening to exercise that revenge by disrespecting the flag and the anthem. And we now know from polling, right, that 2/3 of Americans essentially agree with him on that. So that was easy. Revenge is a dish best served cold. I mean, if he's been waiting 30 years, essentially he picked a fight he knew he would win. And I think probably surprising to him and certainly surprising to me, the NFL decided to double down on their terrible position and triple down on their terrible position. And now they're that kid that's punching themselves in the face because Trump doesn't have to do anything the way they've managed to dig their own hole at this point. So this is not about, I see these comparisons to the black athlete with the black glove who raised his fist at I think it was the Mexico City Olympics back in the 60s. This is not the same thing. That athlete made no money. He went to the Olympics poor. So for that black man to make that protest, still probably not appropriate, but he's a lot more sympathetic than the 1%ers among these, all the black athletes are 1%ers trying to virtue signal on this. So, and the worst image was in Pittsburgh, where the Steelers didn't come out for the national anthem. To send some message to what? The Steelers fans? This is a community in western Pennsylvania that's been devastated by the loss of the steel industry and the shutdown of all those mills. These are middle class and lower middle class whites in western Pennsylvania. They have no power. They're far more sympathetic than 1%er black athletes who are lecturing them, trying to send some message to them. So it's ridiculous. It is the exact opposite of the Mexico City picture. It's an epic fail. Politically, they're on terrible ground because their message is wrong and their messengers are wrong. Nobody cares what 1%ers in Hollywood or on the athletic field think about anything because 1%ers have all the power. I don't care if they're black. They have a hell of a lot more power than those Pittsburgh steel mill workers or descendants of. All of those black athletes combined have billions of dollars. They can get off their asses and do something in the inner cities if they want to, a lot more than a bunch of steel workers in Pennsylvania can. So whoever does the PR for the NFL should not only be fired but banned from the business because they took the low ground and then they sent in reinforcements to hold the low ground. The elites only hear themselves. I saw a bunch of the mainstream media retweeting these stories about how the players and the owners were united and saying, there, you see the president is losing. They're coming together. Who's coming together? Two sides of the 1%ers? It's just ridiculous. And then a day later, we finally get the poll that shows 65% of Americans agree with Trump. The MSN, the mainstream media, they're just garbage. They're idiots. But of course, they're in elite status too. A lot of them are 1%ers themselves or 5%ers. I mean, most of them make six figures or more in these outfits. It's just ridiculous. Trump was speaking for the people who didn't have power. You want to know who has power? Who can speak out and get praised? Right? When the players take the knee, they get praise. So that doesn't take courage. Think of the players. You want to know who doesn't have power. Look at that poor Steelers player who felt the need to apologize to the other players because as a 3-time Afghan and Iraq vet, he came out by himself to salute the flag when the others didn't. And then he feels compelled to apologize and to grovel. It was pathetic and sad, but it's an indication of who has the power. The athletes that want to protest have the power. The athletes in those rooms, in those locker rooms, who think that it's wrong, they don't have power because they're keeping their mouth shut and they're afraid. And now they're expressing some regret for not coming out for the anthem. That's all you need to know about who actually has the power in these scenarios. And Trump is speaking for the people who don't have the power and saying it's okay to love your country. It's okay to believe that the flag should be respected. And he's going to win that argument every time.
And if the NFL owners are going to encourage or let their team members take a knee and not respect the flag, then their audience is going to become fewer and fewer, and eventually college football is going to be the big seller on TV.
I noticed in all the videos of the protests on Sunday, LeSean McCoy of the Buffalo Bills actually got down and began doing his stretching exercises. So there was this image of him doing these back kicks towards the crowd who were booing him while the national anthem was playing. That is not a winning position. It's just terrible. Trump continues to expose the cultural anti-American rot in this country. And for the last 24 months, he's ripped the Band-Aid off and forced us to see just how far the left has advanced. You know, the left has pushed a lot of minorities into taking the anti-American, anti-Western values position. And guess what? A lot of them don't want to do that. As Kurt Schlichter was saying, they get read out of their peer group when they stand up for the country. But, you know, the left is just ceding the patriotic ground to Donald Trump, and he's going to win that every single time. You know, Trump never starts these fights. He's always the one punching back. And he will punch back harder, and it gets some notice. But Doris, when I was making this point to Doris recently, she said, oh, well, what about that time that he criticized McCain? Everybody forgets that McCain had criticized him first. And then he was asked to comment on that criticism of him, and that's when he made the POW crack. So he's always punching back, and he's always picking people with power and influence. Trump doesn't go down and pick the little guy, people without power. He takes on the powerful. And that's why he's beloved. That's why so many people rally behind him. Trump punches back, and it upsets the liberals no end because they expect Queensberry's rules from us. They expect us to take the high ground against them. They always expect us to play the nice guy so that they can play the not nice guy. I think it's glorious the way he triggers them constantly. What is aggravating is all the people supposedly on our side who detest this and grab their perfumed hankies and they grab their pearls when all of this happens. I don't know what they expect, because what's been happening for 100 years is loss after loss after loss. They're not willing to fight with the kind of aggressiveness and determination and emotional intensity that will lead to victories. Trump is not allowing anybody to stand on the sidelines when it comes to this anti-American bullcrap. He sees it going on, and he makes an affirmative statement that in the end forces everybody to take the side of the players who are kneeling or his side. And it's about time that somebody started to draw some lines in the sand and say enough of this anti-American crap.
It must really rankle the Democrats that his approval ratings for standing up for the flag or actually the approval ratings from the public agree with Trump in standing up for the flag.
He's not allowing anybody to remain neutral, and that's a good thing. Are we more polarized? Yes, because we're fighting back against the left. And I'm already hearing it out there, people sort of freaking out about the NFL stuff and everything, you know, the Wall Street Journal's like, everything is now politicized. Well, no, everything already was politicized. We just weren't pushing back. And I have made this point again and again that Trump is not creating this divisiveness, he's exposing it. And it is absolutely unpleasant for us on our side because we're the core and they're the fringe. And I've talked about this in previous podcasts, and I'm going to play some clips from episode 7 and episode 9 to remake this point that we're in this for the long haul, and you're just going to have to gird yourself for this. Here's the clip. And I know that this is particularly uncomfortable for people on our side of the political aisle. They tend to want the country to be calmer, to be more at peace, and for there to be compromise and handshaking and camaraderie. This is part of the fact that we're the core and they're the fringe. Right? We're less interested in the conflict because a lot of us have built stable lives. Even if we've come from chaotic environments as children, part of what makes us the core is that we gravitate towards a more peaceful life, and we build a life that is peaceful and has family in it and all the rest. And we don't like to see somebody with a sledgehammer breaking it all up, or just, we tend to be more uncomfortable with the idea of sort of ongoing conflict. That's something leftists always counted on. Our desire to sort of settle the matter and to come to a compromise. That's driven a lot of what has been given away in the last 100 years. And with Donald Trump, we have a fighter, and he represents this entire movement within the anti-left to fight. And that is making a lot of people on our side very nervous, uncomfortable. Maybe I can deal with it, you think, people say, for a few months, but there's got to be a resolution to this. I can't stay in this mode where everybody's so nasty to each other all the time. It's a lot more wearing on our side than it is on the other side. But I'm here to tell you that there's no road to victory that doesn't involve continuing to be okay with the nastiness. It's going to have to last a while, because the more we resist, the more they ratchet up the hysterics. And I'm going to give you an analogy to explain this. So think of us as the parents and them as the bratty child who hasn't been disciplined for a long time and has become very unruly. That child has learned over time to play the parents against each other and to ratchet up the hysterics and the tantrums until he achieves capitulation, until the parent says, okay, fine, you can have the candy, or you can stay up late, or whatever it is. And that's how you get a bratty child in the first place. Now, if the time ever comes where the parent or parents decide that they would actually like to enforce the discipline, they start in a hole. It's going to take a long time to fix that problem because you have a lot of learned behaviors. You're going to have to be twice the disciplinarian that a normal person would be, because you have to break the child of this idea that they can break you. You have to outlast them. And if it's been going on for years, it could take a long time, months and months, perhaps even a year or more, with that child to get them to understand that you will not capitulate, that there's a new regime, that it's changed. Now, I use that as an analogy to what we're dealing with the left. We've allowed them to get away with a lot, and they've learned that if they ratchet up the pain, we'll eventually seek comfort, seek a compromise to make the conflict go away. I think a lot of the capitulation that happened in the wake of the 60s was a uncomfortable reaction that the core had to all the protesting in the streets and everything feeling like it was coming unglued. So there was a mindset of, can we meet people halfway? Can we give some things in order to create a more peaceful environment? And what did the folks who agitated in the 60s learn from that? They learned that this works. And so they continue to cause mayhem and to create a sense of unbalance in order to achieve their goals.
So, Matt, are you saying that Republicans are gutless because they don't resist?
I'm going to take that as a rhetorical question. My overarching point being that it's going to have to remain nasty for a while, and we're going to have to dig in and be okay with this, and with a president who punches back, and then, of course, gets 20 punches in return as they ratchet up the heat because he's fighting. We have to be okay with that, and we're going to have to be okay with that for some time, because the left is that child throwing the temper tantrum, convinced that if they can just continue to ratchet up the pain and hold out long enough, that we will seek shelter. So if we're going to win, it's going to get a lot worse. And that's a decision for each person listening to my voice to make for themselves. How much can you stand? How much are you up for the fight? People may need to take some breaks, but the truth of the matter is that this process with Trump has just begun. It's just begun. And the left hasn't even shown you their full-throated, violent resistance. If you think it's bad now, wait till the winning continues on the part of Trump and the Trump administration. The globalists and the elites in our society are not going to surrender. So The point of this segment is to simply encourage you to ignore those siren songs because they are going to be quite enticing. This idea of, we all salute the same flag. We all support the same Constitution. It's Barbra Streisand. It's BS. We don't all salute the flag. Look at Colin Kaepernick. I mean, the evidence is out there and it's overwhelming. The left has no interest in forming a unified country with us. They want us to unify behind the country they're going to create. A socialist, globalist, unfree collective. They're happy to talk about that unity. So resistance is going to be unpleasant, and it's going to continue to be unpleasant, and I can't spare you from that. But if you fall for these weasel words, they're going to, look, we're the ones on our side. We're the ones that are patriotic. We're the ones that love this country. We're the ones that support the military, believe in femininity and masculinity and the family and basic concepts, that have propelled this country to greatness. And so when people start talking about those things and they write clever songs, we're lovable dupes. We fall for that stuff. We want to believe that the country can be unified and that we can all sing Kumbaya and get together and fight a common enemy or what have you. But when that stuff comes, it's going to come from Hollywood and the liberal commanding heights, and when it's the leftists, they're lying with a big smile on their face. They're just trying to see how much you'll bite, like Pavlov's dog, how much you'll salivate when they roll that crap out to deceive us. And then they'll be aided by Republicans, the never-Trumper types, the McCains and Lindsey Grahams of the world, who also believe that we'll simply salivate when the music's played and fall in line and stop resisting. So there it was, episode 7 and episode 9. Stay tough. So Doris and I were bemused by apparently the absolute insanity that is going on in Illinois. Some cartoonist does a cartoon that's pro-school choice for blacks, and he depicts a little kid with a white guy, a big kind of, basically a political boss, who's not willing to let him out of his school. And this hysteria goes up about the fact that the kid's lips are drawn a little bit fatter, I guess to indicate that he's a black kid, and that he's small in proportion to the political boss who's big. I mean, it was just hysterical because, of course, immediately it was possible to look at leftist cartoons of Obama and lots of other blacks, and they do the same thing with the lips. It wasn't grotesque. Doris and I have looked at the picture. The cartoon was totally normal. I mean, cartoons are themselves a little bit of an exaggeration for effect, but there was nothing racial about it or racist in any way, and the cartoon was pro-black. And then it turns out that there are lots of other cartoonists who've drawn it the same way, including, it's just amazing to me. And so what happened in Illinois this month was that the left decided to make a controversy out of nothing and to essentially this is what the communists used to do. They used to claim that there were traitors, and then when you got arrested, you were expected to come into court and just admit your guilt. There would be leniency if you admitted your guilt. If you protested your innocence, then, you're going to die. Sound familiar to those of us who remember the Salem witch trials? You were expected to confess that you were a witch. And if you didn't, then that was further proof you were a witch. And then they would dunk you, remember? And if you floated, well, then you were a witch and they were going to burn you at the stake. And if you drowned, well, it turns out you weren't a witch.
So if you admitted you're a witch, then they killed you anyway.
Well, sometimes you could they probably would. Yeah, I mean, it's a heads we win, tails you lose scenario. So this witch hunt gets started, and you expect the left to go crazy. But then they made a bunch of Republicans join this mob. There were Republican elected officials who came out, because this had been put out by a conservative think tank that supported school choice. They put out this cartoon. And so because the governor had once spoken there or had received some help from that think tank, they wanted him to condemn it. And some staff members of his apparently were fired, which makes zero sense. And there were some elected Republicans who came out and did the scraping and bowing on this thing. For those of you who are in Illinois, you should identify every Republican who participated in this or fell to their knees and begged for forgiveness, and you need to primary them all out because they are absolutely gutless. We are in a post-Trump era now, and these people who cave when there is absolutely nothing going on, they're showing you that they're not fighters. You got to get rid of them now because you're going to have future fights, and these people are never going to have your back. They have shown you a complete inability to stand up for core principles or even just reality, because the mob got going and they just freaked out. So get rid of them. You're going to get rid of them now. I'm telling you, they're useless to you. So there was a church shooting in Tennessee, which most Americans probably didn't hear about because it got about 12 hours of coverage and then it was immediately thrown into the memory hole. And why was it thrown into the memory hole? Because it destroyed every single narrative that the mainstream media pushes. A black man walked into a church and shot white people. 1 dead and several injured. If this sounds like the Dylan Roof shooting, it's because it is in reverse, racial reverse. Not just a black man, a Sudanese immigrant who came here when he was 5 and who had a social media account filled with black power and anti-white statements and proclamations. So, just as egregious, but will there be calls to take down any statues or any wider cultural repercussions any retconning that needs to happen? Because no, it just went. They just unzipped the memory hole, whoop, plopped it in there, and 24 hours later, it was as if it did not happen. The mainstream media is complete and utter garbage. And if you do not understand that they are working every day to advance the leftist cause, you are not awake. So Graham Cassidy collapsed. Totally expected. Doris said the first healthcare thing wouldn't pass. I thought they knew what was best for them and that they would get something through. I was wrong. I admitted it, and you cannot fool me twice. So when the Graham Cassidy thing came along, my immediate reaction was, nope, no way do they get that through. And they didn't.
Well, I thought there was more hope for that one because it simply didn't come from Trump. But once again, it's the Republicans in disarray.
Well, I mean, they're showing us who they are, and they've got to go. I hope you all have long memories because some of these folks, like Lindsey Graham, they're not running this time. They're not up until 2020 or 2022, but we've got to remain vigilant and make sure that they all go. It'll take us 6 years to get rid of all these folks, but we can do it. We can do it. I see that the Trump folks are now announcing that he may sign an executive order to allow the buying of healthcare insurance across state lines. I also saw that Ann Coulter said legally she didn't think it would work. I'm not sure at this point whether it's an attempt to simply placate us by looking like they're doing something or whether they think they really do have a legal mechanism to open this up. They're trying to create essentially these groups that can buy across state lines. So people like, say, the NRA could have a health insurance group that any of their members could be a part of. I think it may work, so we'll just have to see. You know, it goes back to my point about health savings accounts, though, that it's not just enough to create these things. The Republicans and all of the think tanks and the whole conservative apparatus has to get behind promoting this stuff to encourage it to grow. Republicans did not do enough to encourage the growth of health savings accounts and to beat the Bushes out there to get more businesses, small businesses and the rest to transfer over to them. So, you know, they're out there, these think tanks, they're all out there promoting stuff, but they're not doing a good job of getting marshaled at the right time on the things that we, you know, on the messages, pushing the messages that we need them to at the right moment.
For some states, if they can't buy across their state line, they'll have no insurance at all because all the insurers are leaving Obamacare.
Yeah, from the Obamacare system, that's true.
I received a phone call this morning with a one-question survey, and it was actually a person on the line, so it wasn't automated. The question was, which do you trust more, the federal government or the state government? So I thought for a moment and said, are those my only two choices?
So, Doris, what do you think about the president's response to the hurricanes so far in Texas and Florida and the Caribbean?
Well, I think he's done a pretty good job with that, certainly better than what has been done in the past. But you do realize that whatever he did was going to be not enough for the media.
Yeah, they're trying to turn Puerto Rico into Katrina because they're always trying to do something like that. Of course, it is nice to see them trying to fight the last battle. My immediate instinct was that that's a weak position if your best plan is to try to marry Trump to a W scandal, which was, of course, entirely false. It was a false narrative that they created back in 2005. But if that's your best hit, is to try to tie him to that, I think they're running out of ammo. And obviously, the Russian thing has collapsed, and so they're just flailing at this point, looking for something to take hold. And in the midst of all of that, all of these hurricanes that came through, Trump has a property in Florida, and he has property, I think, in some other places in the Caribbean. Every single one of his properties was untouched by the hurricane.
Well, somebody's looking over him.
So the Vietnam series is running on PBS, and Doris and I had suggested it as viewing with some hesitation that we hoped that Ken Burns had not lost too many steps. And I'll say that I'm through episode 5 or 6. I'm up to about March of 69, so episode 7 maybe. And I will say that my initial impression was better than my feeling about the show as it went along. It is losing a little something as it goes along. So since I haven't seen the last few episodes, I'm a little concerned at this point. So it's a mixed bag, I guess, is the review that I would give about this. First of all, it's extraordinarily well done, and they have found all sorts of footage from both sides of the conflict, including a lot of color footage, that they've edited together very well. And so as far as a kind of point-by-point history of the war itself, the battles and, the actual technical aspects of the war with their maps and everything, that's extremely well done. And it's probably worth watching the show just for that element. And it gives the early history leading up to the war, which I think a lot of people are not familiar with. That's done extremely well. I know my history fairly well on this stuff, and it really is beautifully done. Where the show starts to miss a step is when we start to get to the point where a lot more American troops, the first ground troops, are starting to come into the country. Because then a peace movement begins in the United States. And the show covers that, but it really has a blind spot when it comes to that. The Ken Burns staff and his folks, they have no problem showing the duplicity that was going on the government side, both the positives and the negatives about what was being accomplished, but also, what they were lying about and what they were withholding from the American people. And so on that side of it, I have no problem with that because it is a mixed bag. But on the peace movement side, they do nothing critical. They simply leave the impression, without saying it directly, that this is a spontaneous peace movement or anti-war movement that develops in reaction to the war. And that is not true. Matter of fact, so far, the only actual statement about the peace movement that I've heard the series say is that Johnson asked the FBI and CIA to investigate it for subversive elements, and they found none. First of all, if that's the only statement that they're going to do in the show about the left anti-war movement, it's a disservice. So on the protest side, the show really falls down because it needs also that nuanced look, just like the war and the administration are getting in this series. Because there were a lot of people who were genuinely pacifists who joined the movement, and there were a lot of people who were educated about what was going on in the war and were genuinely against it. But it was also organized by subversive elements. And there were a lot of strongly anti-American elements and organizations, including communist sympathetic organizations that were involved in those movements. And there was an international communist movement that was alive and well in the world, subverting governments all over the globe, including the United States. And to not address those elements of the anti-war movement is to leave a gaping hole and to give a false impression that this was just Quakers and your average 1950s mom and her children coming out to protest the war because they thought what was going on in North Vietnam was wrong. That was certainly one element of it, but that was not the only element, and there's no nuanced view given of those protests, and that is wrong. And I'll give you an example. They picked this march on Washington that occurs in 68, I think it is, and they were not allowed to be anywhere near the Capitol, and so they wanted to march on the Pentagon, and they were going to do that spontaneously. And so they do, and then they're met by soldiers who are ringing the Pentagon who keep them out. And they show some footage of this, and they're giving their details, and then they move on. They never make the comment, but you can see when you look at the video, the footage, that some of the protesters are carrying North Vietnamese flags, right? So think of this in 1968, protesters carrying the flag of the North Vietnamese communists. That's not a protest against war or a pro-American protest. Those are active communist sympathizers. And those flags, if you look at the protest footage, those flags are there constantly. And it's never remarked on by the narrators or the producers of the show. So the hint is there that this is not just a bunch of 1950s moms who love America and are protesting the bombing in North Vietnam, but they don't address what you can see with your own eyes. And of course, it's the same way the protest movements are depicted today. They never really want to go into the crowd and show you the really hardcore anti-American feelings that people will express if you put a microphone in front of their face. They'd rather step back 25 feet and just show the crowd going by, so that you get this sense that, oh, it's just a bunch of Quakers who really just don't want war. So they've totally dropped the ball on the protest side of it. But I can't really say that it's a terrible series or that I wouldn't recommend it, because the war itself is documented exceptionally well and accurately. And again, there's just a tremendous amount of footage that's very good. They have picked a lot of their interviews. They interview on both sides, North Vietnamese. Those are especially interesting. But a lot of the people they've chosen to interview on our side are not necessarily sympathetic. So that's not as balanced as it could be. But I still think the information is mostly accurate. You have to watch it with a discerning eye, but there is a lot to glean from it. So I'll leave it up to you. I would recommend it, but I think, you can't watch it unconsciously. You have to be actively aware that Ken Burns and his staff are left of center. And while I think in their minds they think they're doing a fair job, like I said, they've really fallen down on the protest side. If they had depicted the protests in a more balanced way, if they had been clear that while there were well-intentioned people there were also people who were not well-intentioned in that movement, if they'd gone out of their way to make that clear, I actually would be willing to give this show a B+ or better, maybe even an A-, because I think that the work they've done around depicting the war and the maps and the battles, it's really, really good. And of course, there's a lot of information that's come out since then about what the administrations knew, that the Lyndon Johnson tapes have been released, and to have that all woven in so that you know as you're watching what the American people did not know at the time, that's all really valuable and that's well done. So Doris and I saw The Kingsman, The Golden Circle this week, and it's kind of a throwback to the old James Bonds that sort of did this good guy, bad guy with a wink and a smile and a little bit of toxic masculinity thrown in. And so it's a lot of fun in that respect. Doris, what did you think?
Well, they were cute British agents dressed in Savile Row suits, and I found it very humorous. And the special effects were great, really good, and some things I hadn't seen before. But mostly what I thought was it was a stuntman's dream job. They must have used 25 stuntmen for that production. And
normally I would complain about the highly stylized action and things that are used in other movies, but here the movie is not taking itself terribly seriously. Everything's done with a wink and a nod, so that the action sequences can be absurd, and that's just fun because the show doesn't pretend to be realistic in any way. Everything's sort of hyper stylized, and so that they have a lot of great lines. There is that whole Austin Powers, old James Bond element of sort of making self-deprecating and making fun of themselves and having a good time and not taking the whole thing too seriously. I did read that the director had toned down some of the anti-Trump stuff that they had originally thought about putting in the movie, which was smart. I was reading this article, and they filmed this back in 2016 when it was still just a race. And apparently they were going to make the Oval Office kind of gaudy to suggest that the presidential character was kind of Trump-esque. And the director said to his producer, well, Trump may win. Is this going to be funny next year when we release the film if Trump wins? And his producer said, Trump's not going to win. You don't have to worry about it. And the director said, well, I think there's at least a chance he might. So we're not going to do the Oval Office that way. And, of course, his instincts were very, very good. And apparently they had some lines in there that they were sort of Trumpist, and they decided to take them out. So they made some smart decisions, because I don't think the presidential character is like Trump in any way, shape, or form. And I think it was pretty much free of any kind of
political commentary.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that as much as sort of a leftist bias. I didn't sense this kind of social justice warrior crap that is just inserted into so many movies and TV shows now. It was fairly missing from this, and the show was more about just having a lot of fun. So I would recommend it. I probably wouldn't give the movie more than a B+, maybe B+, but it's just good fun. And there isn't a lot else to recommend out there. So if you're just looking for a good time at the theaters, mindless and funny, there's some great laughs in there. I recommend this movie.
So I was reading in a magazine that a 3-night Bondiversary is coming up Sunday through Tuesday, October 1st through the 3rd on Sundance TV. You'll have a license to chill for 3 nights in a row with England's greatest spy if you want to catch up with an old James Bond.
Okay, so we're just about out of time. You can hear this show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Pocket Cast. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow, so I'm hoping that you'll like the show on whatever service you're listening to it, and recommend us. Get one friend turned on to this show. That's all we ask. Trump supporters, you are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.